You can go ahead and be turning in your Bibles to John chapter 18, Luke chapter 22, and Matthew chapter 26. Those are the three places because we're literally having a Bible study this month because of the nature of the topic we're discussing, that we need to compare the gospel writers and their viewpoint and what they bring out that another gospel writer does not. Last week we covered Jesus' arrest, and as he was being led away, we noted in Mark 15:1 as we closed that, and when they had bound Jesus, they took him away violently. Even though he did not resist arrest, he showed him the power to not be arrested very easily, but he still willingly went with them. And it says they led him away, and that imagery of that Greek word apago is the same word they use when they would lead a sheep away. They'd wrap a rope around the sheep's neck and pull him and lead him to slaughter. Well, that's the same imagery we have here by the use of that particular word. They bound him as if he was some animal, and they led him away. And it fits with Isaiah 53:7 that says he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter. And just as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, in other words, doesn't say a word, so he opened not his mouth. And we noticed that as we concluded last week. So now we pick up with what happens after his arrest. His arrest occurred around midnight. Now keep in mind, as we noted before, Jesus got up during cockcrow, for prayer time. So he's probably been up since 3 a.m. And he had a long day. Then he had the Last Supper, which was preparation for and teaching it, the foot washing, all that. Then he goes through the writhing and anguish in the Garden of Gethsemane, which in and of itself would wear you out. And then after that, here he gets arrested. And he'll be up all day. He won't get any rest at all. Because between midnight and the time he's scourged, he faces 6 trials. 3 Jewish trials between now and dawn, between 5 and 6 a.m., and then the 3 Roman trials. The 3 Jewish trials would be to Annas, Caiaphas, and before the Sanhedrin. And when we get to the Sanhedrin, it's interesting to note that when the Sanhedrin convened, there was what they called the Lesser Sanhedrin and the Greater Sanhedrin. The Lesser Sanhedrin was a council of 23. The Greater Sanhedrin was the whole assembly, that of 71. Okay? It's almost like in our Senate and our House Representatives, they may have a certain committee that's just part of the whole group. Well, that's the way it is here. And depending upon the nature of the reason for them convening as to whether they would bring the Lesser Sanhedrin or the Greater Sanhedrin together, it stands to reason that they probably brought the Lesser Sanhedrin, which were the 23 dignitaries, because it would probably be hard to get everybody together, all 71 at a moment's notice. It was probably much easier to get the 23 together. And you say, why 23 as opposed to 20? Why 71 as opposed to 70? Well, that's obvious. You want an odd number, so if there's voting on something, there would be a tiebreaker. Okay? And they would act as, if you will, the Jewish Supreme Court. For all the Jewish matters, the Sanhedrin was like the Supreme Court. But before we get there, we got to go to Annas first and then to Caiaphas. And then the 3 Roman trials would be to Pilate, Herod, and then back to Pilate, and we'll get to that. So where do we begin? We begin in John 18 and verse 12. It says, so the Roman cohort, which is the cohort we spoke of in the garden that came to arrest him, 1/10 of a Roman legion, so 600 or about 600 soldiers. It says the Roman cohort and the commander and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him and led him to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was expedient for one man to die on behalf of the people. We'll stop there because then it goes into Peter and his denials, okay? And we'll get back to that later. All right? As far as this is concerned, the first stop is to Annas' house. Now, who is Annas? Annas arguably is the high priest, but officially Caiaphas is the high priest. Now, it's illegal to have two high priests. Okay, that just goes against the law. But it was corrupt as it is anyway. So let me explain to you how this came about. Annas was the high priest and he served for 9 years. But he had been deposed prior to this by the Roman governor or procurator Valerius. Just like Pilate was a governor, well, the governor Valerius had deposed him for whatever reason. He had ousted him from office. So he passed the office down to his son-in-law, Caiaphas, because Annas had a daughter named Anna, named after him, and Caiaphas married Anna. So he wanted to keep everything in the family because the high priest position was like a monarchy. Annas himself had inherited the position, so to speak. It was passed down in his family. So it was just like, the queen and her family, or the king and his family over in England. It's a monarchy, this high priesthood. And even after Caiaphas, would leave office in AD 36, it would be passed down from there to his family members. Why? They wanted to keep the reins of power in the family. Now, even though Annas had been deposed, most people still saw him as the high priest, even though technically his son-in-law, the young buck, was officially the high priest. Now you say, how else can we explain this? At the risk of somebody listening to this online and politically getting upset, we'll go and say it anyway. Y'all know as well as I do that Barack Obama served 3 presidential terms back to back to back. Y'all do know that, right? Because Joe Biden was technically in office, but everybody knows Barack Obama was pushing the buttons. Everybody knows that. All during the whole COVID thing, all these agendas that were pushed forth, all these decisions, everybody knows good and well. If the liberals wanted anything done, they go right past Joe Biden and they were going straight to Barack Obama. He's the one controlling the whole thing. It's the same way here. Everybody still saw Annas as being it, even though he technically is no longer in office. As far as they're concerned, you're still the one in charge. So they go to him first. Now, both Annas and Caiaphas were Sadducees. And the Sanhedrin's made up of Pharisees and Sadducees. Well, here's the thing about the Sadducees, is they did not believe in the supernatural at all. So obviously they had a problem with Jesus' miracles. They didn't believe any of it. They thought it all was hogwash. Even the Old Testament, now these are people who study the scriptures. The Sadducees, even the Old Testament events, like say for instance, the Valley of Dry Bones. Well, they just saw that as a myth. They just didn't believe in the supernatural. And then on top of that, they are control freaks. They are constantly looking over their shoulder to see who may be rising up the ranks that may be a threat to them. They could not stand Jesus' ministry because it was beyond their control. They couldn't put their fingers on it. They couldn't manipulate it. Just like Annas could manipulate Caiaphas to do whatever he wanted, they couldn't do Jesus that way. And of course, we noted in John 11 that Caiaphas is the one responsible for suggesting that one man die for the people, but also he's the one responsible for arranging this illegal Jewish trial by the Sanhedrin when we get to it. Why? You just didn't have trials in the middle of the night. Court's not in session. You work for a lawyer, there's no court in session between midnight and 6 a.m. Court don't convene to 9 a.m. in the morning? You just don't have trials then or now in the middle of the night. But when you're in charge, and you hold the power. They probably called the 23 Sanhedrin together. But first they got to stop off at Annas' house and then Caiaphas' house. Now Caiaphas had great influence in the business realm, in the spiritual realm, in the political realm, and in all financial realms. He was a powerful man. Just as today, as we mentioned, you know who probably had his hand in the stock market, had his hand in, who ran for what office, had his hand in other matters relating to business and the economy. You just got your hands in everything. It was control, control, control. Caiaphas was also the one who would continue to persecute after Jesus' death. Because again, he stayed in office to AD, 36, I think it was? He is the one in Acts chapter 4 that Peter and John had to go before when they were preaching on the kingdom and the resurrection of Jesus. He's the one who interrogated Stephen in Acts chapter 7 and verse 1. And then to top it all off, he's the one who authorized Saul to persecute the church in Acts chapter 9 in the first couple of verses there. So even after Jesus, he's still persecuting the church. He's a crook. And it says in John 18 in verses 15 and 16 that when Simon Peter is following, it says, and so was another disciple. Now you say another disciple, who could it be? Well, if it would have been one of the 11, they would have mentioned it. So it's not that particular disciple they're referring to. Is it one like the road to Emmaus? They probably would have mentioned that. But the key thing is, it says that he was recognized, this other disciple who's unknown, but he was known by Caiaphas. Caiaphas knew him by name. So many think that maybe this particular other disciple was Nicodemus. There's a good chance it's Nicodemus. Because after all, Nicodemus is keeping an eye on things. Because remember, he switches over and he is secretly a believer. He's the one that speaks up in the Sanhedrin whenever in John chapter 11 when he was defending Jesus. He's the one who would put him in the tomb along with Joseph Arimathea. He's the one that would bring 100 pounds of spices to anoint him for burial. Okay? So, if this right here was on TV or a movie, then you'd be segueing from scenes both inside these meeting halls and then outside with what's happening outside. Okay, with Peter being tempted to deny Jesus, it would just be going back and forth. Okay, so we will go back and forth. Now, the visit with Annas is brief because John's gospel is the only one that mentions it. None of the others mention it. Because of the legalities involved, he still wanted a piece of the action, but he knows in order to get things officially done, Caiaphas has to stamp it. So he's not going to stay there long. But look in verse 19 through 23. It says, the high priest therefore questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. And Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I have taught in the synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together, and I spoke nothing in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who have heard what I spoke to them. Behold, these know what I said. And when he had said this, one of the officers standing by gave Jesus a blow, saying, is that the way you answer the high priest? He did not like the way Jesus responded to him. Okay, and when it says a blow, he doesn't mean like he's blowing out a candle. A blow with a fist. An officer. Someone who's probably looks the size of The Rock, Dwayne Johnson. A big old burly, strong, muscled up soldier. He hauls off and punches Jesus. Why? Because he's being prompted to by the religious. What you're going to see here before Jesus steps on the cross is you're going to see religious hate exposed. The hate of religion. It's religion that put Jesus on the cross. Their jealousy of him. And it says in verse 22, an officer strikes him, and they're accusing him of disrespect. Okay? Jesus replies in verse 23. He says, if I've spoken wrongly, bear witness of the wrong. But if rightly, why do you strike me? He says, if I've done anything wrong, if I've committed an offense, then tell me what it was. He said, but if I've committed no offense, you have no reason to strike me. Now, seeing where this is headed, it says, Annas therefore sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. He goes ahead, and we got to go ahead and dismiss. We appreciate y'all coming to me because y'all know I'm the one that punches the buttons around here. But my son-in-law is technically the high priest. He's the one that's got to sign the order. So we're going to have to dismiss and go straight to his house. For that, let's flip over to Matthew 26. Because Matthew 26, beginning in verse 57, gives a better detailed account of the action at Caiaphas' house. Now we'll begin in verse 57 and we'll read through 67. And those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. Well, either they followed him there, or they had already, sent notice to them to get him up out of bed and say, hey, we've arrested Jesus. We're at Annas' house right now, but we're on the way to Caiaphas', so meet us there. That could be what happened there. And it says, but Peter also was following him at a distance, as in the courtyard of the high priest, and entered in, and sat down with the officers to see the outcome. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus in order that they might put him to death. Any and everybody that's there, they're saying, okay, does anybody have an accusation? If so, speak up. We want to hear it. Did he say anything? Did you catch him saying anything that was blasphemous? Did you catch him saying anything that would break Jewish law or Roman law? If so, speak now or forever hold your peace, so to speak. And they did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. But later, 2 came forward. So it says many false witnesses. Now, this is the hate of religion. Because the hate of religion is go fabricate something. Fabricate an accusation that they said, okay, we understand you don't like the man. We don't like him any more than you do. But what you're claiming, we can't, that's not really grounds that we can take before the Sanhedrin. That's not something that we can charge him with. That's inadmissible, so to speak. It's inadmissible evidence. It's not something that we could, really go to before the whole Sanhedrin with. So they go through many witnesses. And then finally 2 more come up. So chances are this meeting at Caiaphas' house probably lasted between 2 and 4 hours. Somewhere in that neighborhood, between 2 and 4 hours, because they were trying to drum up accusations. Let's read on. And 2 witnesses came forward and said, this man stated, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Now we need to understand, these people are ignorant. Just as we taught on Sunday, when Jesus was teaching in John 6 about eat my flesh and drink my blood, they think cannibalism. They just didn't get it. When these 2 witnesses come up and said, I heard him say, destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. Jesus is obviously referring to his body, the temple of Holy Spirit, just as our body is the temple of Holy Spirit. But they didn't see it that way because they're thinking from the law, 2 Chronicles 36:19, then they burned the house of God and broke down the wall of Jerusalem and burned all of its fortified buildings with fire and destroyed all its valuable articles. That was the last chapter of the last book chronologically in the Old Testament. 2 Chronicles 36, if you didn't know. Malachi is the last book that we see in the Old Testament canon. But it wasn't the last one written. The last one written originally is 2 Chronicles. And chapter 36 is the last chapter. And you got to understand, there's years of silence. There's no prophetic voice going on until Jesus arrives on the scene. So that's the last thing they got in their memory, in their Jewish history, was this happening. So it says in verse 62, and the high priest stood up and said to him, do you make no answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you? Why aren't you answering for this? You have no response? Can you explain? Why didn't Jesus respond? Why didn't he? He probably figures there's no need to, because you're just going to twist everything anyway. Obviously, you're twisting what I said because I'm talking about this body and you think I'm talking about that temple. So if I say anything, you're going to twist it anyway. So look in verse 63. The high priest can't stand it. The high priest wants Jesus to say something so they can catch him in his words. They're trying to bait him here. And in verse 63, he finally gets fed up. It says, but Jesus kept silent, and that irritated him. So the high priest just, oh, okay. If it must come to this, he says, I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, when he used that word adjure, in the Greek is exorchizo. And what it means simply this. He put Jesus under oath. Just as in a court of law, do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? All that is wrapped up in that word adjure. When the high priest said to Jesus, I adjure you, you're under oath. I demand, as the judge, I demand that you reply now. You're under oath. Jesus submitted to authorities. So he responds. And it says, if Jesus would have said, I am, they probably would have all fallen out. But Jesus says, no, that happened in the garden. Now is not the time because now the ball is rolling. I'm supposed to die. So let's go ahead and let it happen. So it says here in verse 63, determined to tell us whether you're the Christ. Jesus said to him, you have said it yourself. That's the way Jesus replies. He doesn't say, I am. He just says, it is as you say. You've said it yourself. And when that happened, then it says, well, we'll get to it in verse 65 in just a moment. So hold your finger there, and now let's flip to Luke 22, because Luke brings a part into this narrative that we need to see. In verse 63, Luke 22 and verse 63, picks up right after Peter denies him. And it says, and the men who were holding Jesus, this is still at Caiaphas' house, in custody, were mocking him and beating him. Mocking him and beating him. Now, I'm reading out of the New American Standard. In the King James, I'm going to bring out the words that it says in the King James and explain what they mean. Okay. It says they mocked him. Now, you know what mock means. That means they made fun of him. They snickered. And what was the context? The context that we just read in Matthew's version has to do with destroy this temple and I will rebuild it. So let's just go ahead and put ourselves in the narrative here. Jesus was known as what? The carpenter. He was known as the carpenter's son until Joseph died. We see that in Luke chapter 4. They referred to him as the carpenter's son. But in Mark chapter 6, they refer to him as the carpenter, not the carpenter's son, but the carpenter in Mark 6, which indicates that when Joseph died, Jesus took over until it came time to start ministry at the age 30. Nonetheless, as we've discussed at Christmas time, that word for carpenter is one of the most mistranslated words in the New Testament. It's tekton, which is where we get technology from. And Jesus was not an ordinary woodworking carpenter. He was like a building supervisor. He was like the architect. But you got to think, there's no trees around. My brother's here in the logging business. There's no trees around. They're in the middle of dirt, sand, and desert. So what did they build with? Stone. So chances are here, and you'll see it happen again, when it says they mock him over the statement, destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it. Chances are they may have some blocks and they stack some blocks up. And then just like you do with your playing with a little kid, they stack some blocks up and then they knock them over. Okay, rebuild it, Jesus. They're probably doing things like this just to mock him. And all of them are just, ha, 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 ha. They just get the big kick out of it. But they probably mocked some other things that he did. Maybe they pretended to lay hands on a sick person. I don't know. But it's all wrapped up in that word mock. Okay, read on to verse 63. It says they were mocking him and they were beating him. Now that word beat in the King James is smote. S-M-O-T-E. And in the Greek, it is the word dero. D-E-R-O. And it means to skin or to thrash, to hit him with something, as in straps or whips. Could have been a belt, could have been an actual whip, could have been some other kind of strap that they tied something down with. But that word smote referred to, it was the same word they would use if you were beating a slave. Now, did you beat a slave with your fist? No. They would beat a slave with a whip. So here, before Caiaphas, it says they smote him. And because it uses the word dero, it was like beating a slave, and also in doing so, it would flay the flesh open, so the flesh would be laid open just like a gash. This is all happening before he gets to the cross. Where did they hit him? We don't know. It doesn't say. But he already had gashes from Caiaphas, and he ain't even gotten to the Sanhedrin yet. He ain't even gotten to Pilate, Herod, and back to Pilate yet. This is happening now. Read on. It says, and they blindfolded him and were asking him, saying, prophesy, who is the one who hit you? And they were saying many other things against him, blaspheming him. Now, verse 64, it says they blindfolded him. Why? Because they didn't want him to see who was about to hit him. Because it was all part of making fun, because you see what it says. Prophesy to us who hit you. Who hit you? And it says when they hit that word hit you is struck, which is a different Greek word, okay, and it means to hit with a stick. It's the word tupto in the Greek. T-U-P-T-O. Tupto means to thump or to pummel with a stick. And not only that, but it denotes repeated blows. You say, how do you know it's repeated blows? Because when you look at the scriptures and you study the words in the Greek, anytime it refers to a single blow, it would either be the Greek word P-A-I-O or P-A-T-A-S-S-O, pio or patasso. But when you use tupto, it refers to multiple blows. Okay? Dero, in the previous verse, referred to hitting with straps or a whip. This refers to hitting with a stick and doing it multiple times. So he got hit with something whip-like, something belt-like in Dero, and he's getting hit with something like a stick. And repeatedly. And then it says, prophesy. In other words, if you're so good at prophesying, then how about prophesy and tell us who hit you? Now, when it says that, that is the word pio. So what they're saying is that you're being hit multiple times. You're blindfolded. If you are the prophet that you say you are, then you ought to be able to tell us which one of us, pioed, hit you individually. You have been tuptoed, repeatedly hit. Now keep in mind there's a Roman cohort here. There's no telling how many people stepped forward, got in line to hit him. It doesn't say. But then these religious leaders, religious hate is getting in his face. You are a prophet, eh? Tell us, Who was it that hit you? Was it Malchus that hit you? Was it Caiaphas that hit you? Who hit you? It was all part of the mockery. And then we read on here. In Luke 22 and verse 65, and they were saying many other things against him, blaspheming him. In mockery, they just simply took the lid off. And as we say down south, they showed their behinds. Religious leaders, Caiaphas, who else would have said was there? Elders of the people. In our line of thinking, deacons and elders. People who served in the ministry. They were there and they just unleashed on him. They made fun of him. They mocked him. They criticized him. They laughed, snickered. That's no way for leaders to act. It's religious hate. And we see it here. But we see it today as well. Jesus is not here in person for them to hate. But who did he leave in his stead? Holy Spirit. And people mock the work of Holy Spirit and say it ain't real. They're treading on the same thin ice. So we need to understand Jesus was already in his second trial, already exponentially looking worse than what we have depicted on any pictures we have on the wall. Because remember it says gashing. He had been beaten. He had been hit in the face. Then in verse 65 through 68, in verse 66 it says, and when it was day, the council of elders of the people assembled both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council chamber, saying, if you are the Christ, tell us. But he said to them, if I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask a question, you won't answer me. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God. And they all said, are you the Son of God then? And he said to them, yes, I am. And they said, what further need do we have of testimony? For we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth. They are livid. Now look over in Matthew 26. Back in Matthew 26. Pick up in verse 65. We're going back and forth here. He says, then the high priest tore his robes. Now he did not tear Jesus' tunic. They said he tore his robes. Because when he's on the cross, his tunic is a special tunic we see in John 19, I think it is. When a young man left home, it was Jewish tradition for his mama to make him a tunic for him to wear as a daily garment. Robe would go on top of it. They did not tear it because in John 19 it's still intact. Because they note that Jesus' tunic is different from anybody else's in the whole region. Jesus' tunic was seamless. And if indeed Mary made it for him, she made it a seamless garment to indicate that he is without sin. He is seamless. He didn't touch that because that's what those who put him on the cross, the soldiers, when they cast lots, this is the grand prize that they're after. This is what they're casting lots for. Whoever got the first time they cast lots, oh my goodness, oh man, I got his sandals. Next one, oh man, I got his robe. I really was hoping I'd get the tunic. That was the grand prize. That was probably the last thing they cast lots for, to see who's going to get it. Or maybe the first thing they cast lots for, to see who gets first choice. Either way you look at it, that was the grand prize. Then the high priest tore his robe, saying, he has blasphemed. What further need do we have witnesses? This is the same thing he just said in Luke's version. Behold, you have now heard the blasphemy. What do you think? They answered and said, he is deserving of death. And they spat in his face and beat him with their fist, and others slapped him. They realized this is what we're looking for. Because in the 3 Jewish trials, he's going to be found guilty, even though he's not guilty. but they're going to find him guilty of blasphemy by indicating and saying that he's the Son of God. So the Jewish trials all find him guilty of blasphemy. When they do the Roman trials, they can't come to them with a Jewish claim because the Romans could care less about the Jewish law. So now they're going to have to come to him when they get to it in a different claim, and that claim's going to be, he claims to be a king. So therefore he's a threat to Caesar. Okay? So they got this strategized perfectly. Before the Sanhedrin, before Caiaphas, before Annas, we're going to question him to see if we can get him to say he is the Son of God. Or if we say it, to get him to say yes. And they finally do. And they said, that's all we need to hear. We find you guilty of blasphemy, according to them. Okay? Now in verse 67, it says they spat in his face. We told you it's graphic. And sorry to sound gross, especially among you ladies, you're going to be like, ugh, gross. But one after another, they hawked huge loogies in Jesus' face. He literally has spit from his forehead and his head and his forehead just dripping down his face. Their nasty, stinking breath in their face bad enough, saying, who hit you? Prophesy. But now he's got their spit. And one scholar notes that the they it refers to could have been 100 or more people who spit in Jesus' face. Now, you wouldn't want one person to spit in your face. You wouldn't even want your own family member to spit in your face. But can you imagine somebody who probably hadn't brushed their teeth in a long time? Somebody whose hygiene isn't the greatest, and yet they're spitting their wads of spit in your face, and yet you can't do anything. There's no towel for you to wash it. Now, offensively speaking, this was the worst thing you could do to express disgust or hatred. If you're trying to offend somebody, if you're trying to humiliate somebody, you're trying to publicly embarrass or put anybody down, the worst thing offensively you could do was spit in their face. Defensively, it was the ultimate form of humiliation. From a defensive standpoint, as the recipient of it, say for instance there's a big party and somebody gets in an argument and somebody spits in their face. The person who received the spitting, that is the ultimate humiliation. And then it says in verse 67, it says, then they spat in his face and they beat him with their fist. And others slapped him. That's interesting. That word for beat him with their fist is buffeted. You've heard it, buffeted. That is kolaphizo in the Greek. And it means to strike or beat with the fist. And it depicts a violent strike or beating. It is haul off with all your might. They are hauling off and they're coming around with their fist, right-handed or left-handed. They're taking turns beating Jesus in the face. He looks worse than a boxer who went 15 rounds because his opponent would have boxing gloves. And you know how swollen a boxer looks. You've seen the Rocky movies. And that's with the opponent. Whether it was Apollo Creed or Clubber Lang or whoever it was he was facing in Rocky 2, 3, the Russian in Rocky 4. You saw he's all, oh, yo, Adrian, and his eyes are all swole shut. And that's when an opponent with boxing gloves. There's no telling how many people, these big burly soldiers, coming barefisted and hitting him in the face. Jesus probably would need to be led where he's going to go because he probably couldn't even see very well out of his eyes. And yet we've got these pictures of having him still looking handsome on a cross. And it says, and others slapped him. Now that word is rapizo. And it means to slap with the palm of the hand, just like you slap in the face. So, if I may suggest, the physically buff soldiers punched him with their fist. And these little wimpy religious people probably came by and smacked him with their face, with their hands, slapped him. It was both. Either way it hurt, either way it stung, and it's in the face, the most tender, precious part of your body. In your face, the most personal part. Now, because this is where most of the spitting occurred, it is very safe to conclude, according to Isaiah's prophecy, that it was at this time, at Caiaphas' house, that they pluck out the beard. Because Isaiah 50 and verse 6 puts the two and two together, the spitting and the plucking out of the beard. He says, I gave my cheeks to those who pluck out the beard. I did not cover my face from humiliation and spitting. I did not try to cover my face. I had my face here. And I let you spit in my face. I let you buffet me. I let you slap me. I didn't try to put up a defense. I didn't try to block it. It says here, I gave it to you. I gave you my face. And it wasn't a taunting like this right here. No, he just humbly gave his face to however many people came by. Whether they hit him square in the face, whether they came from the side, we don't know. But he's a bloody mess, even at this point. And this is just stop number 2. See, there's no reason for Pilate or Herod to pluck out his beard, because they didn't hate him. Pilate says, I find no fault with him. Herod, until Jesus got before him and wouldn't perform a miracle for him, he didn't have a problem with him. It's religious hate that says, what are we missing? You're all bloodied from here up. What are we missing? That beard. It's coming off. Now you know mine's trimmed pretty good. Yours is trimmed pretty good. But if you've got one that they wore, you could get a fistful. Ever had razor burn from having shaved? Maybe you're shaving your neck and you put that aftershave on and you do this. Ooh, it just lights you up. Imagine your beard being plucked out. That in and of itself is painful, because even if you pull one hair out, you're going to feel it. But they're pulling it out and he is bleeding profusely from the chin and his beard area. Then that spit that is coming down his face, the skin is so sensitive, even from razor burn, that even water on your face, even aftershave lotion, unless it's the sensitive skin smoothing type, is going to light you up. Spit is, that sensitivity is lighting his face up. Again, we're still on stop number 2. After this, after the beard's plucked out, because here again, these religious people are after this, because this is what they see in their minds. This is what disgusts them. This is what they hate. And when they had the opportunity to punish this, they said, we're going to deform, we're going to deface, we're going to ruin this right here, because we're tired of seeing it. This right here is what sickens us. That religious hate says, whatever happens from here on out, from here on down, whether it has to do with nails or whips or whatever, that's down the road. But as far as we're concerned, we're going to bloody that face. And that was religious hate. Then it says they go to the Sanhedrin. in Luke chapter 22. Let's go back to Luke chapter 22, beginning in verse 66. And it says, and when it was day, so now the sun's coming up. Remember we said when they had all the people come to try to fabricate stories that it could have been 2 to 4 hours? Well, if he was arrested at midnight and then he goes to Annas' house, say that takes an hour. Then he goes to Caiaphas' house, and that's between 2 and 4 hours. They've plucked out the beard. Now it's time to go to the Sanhedrin. That's why it says in verse 66. It says, and when it was daybreak, probably about 5 a.m., they led him their chamber. At this time of night, it's probably the 23. Chances are they didn't get the whole 71 there. Okay? And not only that, but they may have even met, not here, but they met out in Bethphage, if that was the case. We're not sure. It says, when it was day, the council of elders of the people assembled, both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council chamber, saying, if you are the Christ, tell us. But he said to them, if I tell you, you will not believe, and if I ask a question, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of God will be seated. This is what we read a while ago. And they said, are you the Son of God? And he said, yes, I am. What further need do we have of testimony? We have heard it ourselves with our own mouths. They wanted him to say it before all the rest of them. Y'all need to hear this, guys. Y'all weren't all here at Caiaphas' house. Y'all need to hear this. Okay? So they bring him before the Sanhedrin. As you can see, there's a little bit of an overlap where it's hard to define what was at Caiaphas', what was at the Sanhedrin, and what was repeated that was at Caiaphas' house that they had him repeat before the whole Sanhedrin. It's a little unclear. That's the reason why we read it as part of the Sanhedrin visit, because it says that in Luke's version, but in Matthew's version, it looks like it's at Caiaphas' house. So which is it? Possibly both. And again, the reasoning I give to you is that what he said before Caiaphas and those gathered there, they wanted the rest of the Sanhedrin to hear it for themselves, because they're the ones who are going to have to vote on this matter. So they want them to hear that we're not fabricating this. This is not hearsay. You need to hear it for yourself. So chances are they had him repeat it. All right, now they start on the Roman trials. And obviously we're not going to finish this tonight. Now, picture, if you will, his appearance by the time this is over. Then it says in Matthew 27:2, it says, they bound him and led him away and delivered him to Pilate the governor. Luke 23:1, then the whole body of them, the Sanhedrin, got up and brought him before Pilate. Whether it's the 23 or the 71, we don't know. But it says they dismiss, and it says, according to Luke 23:1, then the whole body of them arose and brought him to Pilate. During Jesus' ministry, all leaders, both political leaders and religious, they were both paranoid. Because what we're shifting here is we're shifting from religious trial to a political trial. Because they know they want him crucified. And we'll explain all this when we get to Pilate. Because they're setting things up here. Because these religious leaders have a threefold plan. Okay? And we'll get to it when we get to Pilate. They finally expose their threefold plan. Something's going to happen. 1, 2, or 3, or some combination thereof. So there's religious trial, which we find him guilty of blasphemy, saying he's the Son of God. But we need him to be politically tried so that the Romans can beat him and that the Romans can crucify him. We can't do crucifixions as Jews, but the Romans can. So that's the reason why they have to have these Roman trials. They can't go with the charge of, he says he's the Son of God, because they can be like, we don't care nothing about that. That's a church matter. So they need to have a political claim they got to file, a charge they got to file. So now you got to play to what triggers a politician, their constituency. You got to appeal to them and threaten their constituency. You're not going to get their vote. You're not going to get their support. So they've got to finagle their way into the political realm here. So if we say that he's claiming to be a king, then he's going to threaten the Roman government. They're at least going to find him guilty of treason. These Romans in political office, they tried their best to hang on to their power as long as they could, but few were able to do so. You would have these uprisings, these upheavals. There was constantly scrutiny upon them. They knew people were looking over their shoulders because, see, whereas in the religious realm, with Annas and Caiaphas, nobody's trying to be the high priest because they know good and well it's a family thing, it's a monarchy. Nobody's going to go to England and try to be the next king because they know it's a family matter. Unless you're kin to Caiaphas and Annas, you can forget about being high priest. But in the political realm, you got a shot. Okay? So, Israel, of course, was under Roman control. And they hated it. They had to swallow a big lump in their throat to go before the Romans to try to get them to help them in this matter. Because they hated the Romans. Because the Romans forced their language and their culture upon them. They taxed them and they overtaxed them. And they had no respect for our holidays, our customs. They have no respect for our festivals. It's like pulling teeth to get them to, clear the streets so we can do our parade, They hated the Romans. Now, after Herod Archelaus was removed from office, Judea was governed by Roman procurators. Sometimes it says that, sometimes it says governors. Same thing. Rome had about 40 provinces, and each of these provinces were governed by a governor or Roman procurator. A normal tenure for a governor was 1 to 3 years. Pilate was already served twice that. Pilate would end up serving 10 years from AD 26 to AD 36. About the same time that Caiaphas left office. Okay? Pilate ruled the whole time during Jesus' ministry. All 3 years of Jesus' ministry, Pilate was on the throne as far as the governor is concerned. He was ruthless. He showed very little mercy. He was a cutthroat type governor. And he had the supreme authority in all legal matters. But here's the thing. As a judge, so to speak, he wanted everything cut and dry. What did you do? You stole? Okay. This is the verdict. Bam, case dismissed. Next. He wanted everything cut and dry. The last thing he wanted to hear as a Roman governor were these Jewish matters, these Jewish whines and complaints. He did not want to hear it. He didn't want to hear anything because they beat around the bush. It wasn't going to be a cut and dry. What was the crime, officer? Okay, here's your penalty. Pay your fine, this many days or weeks in jail, case dismissed. That's the kind of court he used to doing. He did not want this parade of all these people coming to him over a Jewish matter. That's the last thing he wanted. He dreaded these cases, and he wasn't the least bit interested whatsoever. He lived at Herod's palace in Caesarea, and there were about 3,000 soldiers that guarded his place. But because it was during a feast, the feast of the Passover, because it was during a feast, there was a greater chance of there being a riot. There was a greater chance of there being turmoil or issues. So he's definitely on high alert. All his officers are on high alert. And see, Pilate wasn't stupid. Even though he didn't want anything to do with the Jewish, he knew good and well they were jealous of Jesus. He was no idiot. By the nature of their claim, he knew good and well, you're appealing to me simply because you're jealous of this man. I'm well aware of who Jesus is. I know he's the miracle worker. I've already heard rumors. So they knew good and well that they were coming to him just to complain. And he didn't want to deal with it. He didn't want to listen to all their customs. So now let's go to John chapter 18 for the last couple of minutes, and we'll see what we can get here before we close. So in verse 28 of John 18, it says, "And they led Jesus therefore from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early, and they themselves did not enter into the praetorium, in order that they might not be defiled, but might eat the Passover." Okay, that's important. These Jews are going to bring the matter to Pilate. Now keep in mind, what time is it? It's daybreak. Pilate's not happy. We don't convene court this time of morning. And you're knocking on my door this time of morning? They would not go in, it says in verse 28. They would not go in because they're being holy. We're holy. They ain't no telling what kind of corruption we're going to see in there. They're not going in there. They didn't know what this Roman governor's house is like. You know, we're not defiling ourselves by going in there. So they're outside on his front porch, so to speak, his courtyard. So you're going to see they take Jesus inside. Pilate, this ticks him off. He's got to go back and forth. He's got to go inside to question Jesus. He's got to come back outside to hear what they have to say. He's used to sitting on a bench. Y'all come to me. Now he's got to go back and forth. And it's first thing in the morning, before he normally convenes court. He ain't happy. Not in any means. Verse 29, "Pilate therefore went out to them and said, 'What accusation do you bring against this man?'" He's ticked. "And they answered and said to him, 'If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you. We wouldn't have bothered you.' Pilate therefore said to them, 'Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law.' The Jews said to him, 'We are not permitted to put anyone to death.'" There it is, bingo. "That the word of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying what kind of death he was about to die." They came right out and told Pilate. Pilate wants to know, why are you bringing this matter to me? You just handle it yourself. And they said, in a nutshell, here's the religious hate. They said, "We're not authorized to order an execution by crucifixion, but you are. And that's why we're here. That's why we're bringing the matter to you." Pilate didn't want to hear it, but he has no choice to hear it. There's too big of a crowd here, and they're demanding his attention. And that's where we'll pick up next week. The point we're trying to get is this. Picture what Jesus looks like before the crown of thorns, before he's beaten with whips, and before he goes to the cross. As they bring him to him, he's a bloodied mess. Probably can barely see out those eyes. But you can see the religious hate. Religion does hate. It hates then, and religion still hates now. You threaten someone's stranglehold on their position, and the leaven of Herod and the leaven of the Pharisees gets riled up, and it will act.